Mark Leibovich is, I think, reconnected. There he is.
I'm back.
All right, Mark, we're glad that you are back. So let me get your take on this this tweet from the Mexican president, but really, I think a very powerful message from a strong ally partner of the United States, from one head of state to another.
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is sort of where this looked like it was headed. I mean, at least over the last 24 hours or so. I mean, you basically had them, the Mexican president and the Mexican government seemed very upset with the pace they were proceeding on the wall, the continued rhetoric about Mexico's going to pay for it, and then Mexico's going to pay for it. And then you had this morning President Trump essentially taunting them, saying, if you're not going to pay for the wall, don't come. Almost a sense of him sort of getting out in front of this and saying, fine, we don't need this. So I think this seems like an almost predictable, I don't know if it's the end of this story, but certainly the next step of this story. This is 7 days into his administration, or 6 days in, I guess if you count last Friday or not. But it's been less than 1 week, let's say that. And, we are already essentially in a very, very sort of, not major, but certainly a very tense diplomatic showdown with what many people had considered to be, one of our strongest allies to the directly to the south. I mean, we do a lot of business with Mexico. That all doesn't go away. And obviously, this is a fight that Donald Trump is willing to have, and he doesn't think that the fallout is going to hurt him in any way. But I don't know how much he's filled this out. Yeah, sorry.
What's the strategy, though? I mean, sending out the tweet that he sent out, he basically gave Mexico's president no other option. He said either accept a meeting and pay for the wall,
or don't come.
Right.
And he chose not to come. So I wonder, I mean, just from a policy standpoint, the president can sign an executive order to have the wall built. American taxpayers will ultimately foot the bill, at least initially. The president has even said that. But then if the Mexican government is unwilling to pay for it, where does he go from here?
Well, I mean, as far as the strategy goes, I think the strategy exists probably mainly, inside the cranium of Donald Trump, and I'm not sure that there was a lot of planning that went into this. I think ultimately this will come down to an appropriations issue. I mean, I think Donald Trump seems to be showing every indication that he's at least going to get this wall started. I don't think he's waiting for a check to come in from the Mexican government by any stretch. The fact is, this is an appropriations thing. It's going to probably be, it's going to have to be written, it's going to have to be signed off on by Congress, and it's part of a much larger and potentially very, very controversial within the Republican Party spending situation when you have, potentially a very large tax cut. You have, a potentially very, very big infrastructure bill that President Trump says he's wanted. He's also said he's not going to mess with entitlements. So I think this will probably take place in a much larger debate. But at the same time, I mean, I don't think that it's not easy to find any sort of serious Republican around Washington who's willing to say that they really think that the Mexican government will actually be convinced or be somehow compelled to write a check and pay for this. I mean, I just don't think a lot of people think it's going to happen.
So, Mark, then the question I guess that many people will have is, let's say Congress does decide, in fact, to foot the bill, which means that the taxpayers are ultimately footing that bill. Will the people who supported Donald Trump because he made these claims be happy with the wall because they say that they have concerns about illegal immigration and about drugs and other things that Mr. Trump has pointed out in the campaign trail? Or will they feel as if they got a raw deal because they have to pay for it? Because I think part of the allure for his supporters has been that Mexico would pay for it.
Well, whether they actually believed it or not is hard to say, but certainly if you look back at Donald Trump's rallies during the campaign in 2016, there were two chants that you would always hear back to back: build a wall, and then Trump would lead them in the next sort of refrain in that chant, which is, who's going to pay for it? And they would all say, Mexico. I mean, it was sort of a tastes great, less filling kind of thing in a Trump rally. And so you had this responsive chant. I think the second part of it was always very much in question. Now, a lot of it depends on what gets done over the next few years. I mean, I think you can see a scenario where Donald Trump tries to at least sell a message where, oh, well, the Mexicans are paying for it by us renegotiating this deal or not paying this part of our obligation. I mean, there's probably all kinds of rhetorical ways he could get around this. But at the same time, we'll see what the state of the wall is in a year and a half when everyone in Congress is running for re-election. And I mean, you can see a lot of Democrats just saying repeatedly, I mean, this is something that we are all paying for. It is this, partially built wall. Who knows where the money's going to continue to come from. I mean, you have a lot of, as this goes forward, a lot of details that could be very problematic, certainly from an optical standpoint and, from a procedural standpoint.
Yeah, thinking about what you just said about the chant, one of the other chants was lock her up. That isn't even being discussed anymore, and it doesn't seem like any of his supporters are bringing it up or wondering, why we're not discussing that. But we were looking at Air Force One now. Just earlier, we could see Mike Pence at the gathering of GOP lawmakers. They're going to have a chance to talk to the president and ask him a few questions. What do you think will be topping the agenda?
I'm guessing, I mean, it sort of depends how candid they're willing to get with him. I mean, I think there's probably going to be an expectation in that meeting that the stuff's going to leak. I mean, the press isn't going to be in that meeting. But, I mean, we've seen, even from the last few days, that semi-private meetings between the president and people on the Hill, I mean, is going to become public very, very quickly. I think spending will obviously be an issue. I think, things like torture. I mean, I think there are big questions about whether President Trump is going to be willing to campaign for these people who he's essentially run against. I mean, with some exceptions, he is meeting with the Republican establishment today. One of his top aides, Steve Bannon, has made it a priority to absolutely blow up the Republican establishment. I mean, there's a lot of inherent tension there, and while they might be on the same page in a lot of issues, I mean, Donald Trump has announced a number of things in the last few days. He signed a lot of executive orders, but the details here are what is carried out on Capitol Hill. The policy is set generally, largely on Capitol Hill, and also the electoral ramifications will be felt most urgently in the next election, which is only 2 years out. So we'll see.
Two areas of dissension, Mark, seem to be the president's claims about voter fraud and also about enhanced interrogation. Isn't he putting these lawmakers in a difficult position on these issues?
Well, I mean, he's certainly putting them in a position where they're going to be asked to sort of state for the record their position on this. I mean, you don't see a lot of people sort of laying out any evidence about this voter fraud claim, and that includes the White House. I mean, that's just something that a lot of people just roll their eyes at, including, privately, a lot of Republicans. I think as far as torture goes, I mean, that's a little bit of a different topic. It's obviously been one that's been litigated for years post 9/11. And I think it's a less controversial issue to some degree than maybe spending is. But again, I mean, this is something that's going to involve the Justice Department. It's going to be something that involves the Defense Department. I mean, I think the bigger source of tension there is that Secretary of Defense Mattis is on record as being a big opponent of torture, and we'll see where that policy goes. So, look, there's a lot of range of issues that could come up today. I imagine, I mean, depending on how candid it gets, it could get a little heated.
Yeah, and he did mention that he would defer to, the Secretary of Defense in regards to torture. But is there a scenario? You mentioned that this is something that would involve the Justice Department. But is there a scenario in which the law could be reinterpreted and things that may be viewed as torture now could be reinterpreted to be viewed not as torture, and that's a way of sort of getting around it?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of things in what we're talking about here are going to be settled, if not by the Justice Department or within the Justice Department per se, certainly by lawyers and in some kind of judicial proceeding. I mean, a lot of this is interpretation, a lot of this is argument, and we'll see what fights Donald Trump wants to have. I mean, I think the other piece, by the way, about what to look for today in Philadelphia is just the tone that Donald Trump sets. Is he going to be deferential to his partners, putative partners on Capitol Hill, or is he going to come in sort of with a combative tone saying, hey, I was elected on blowing all this up?
Mark, stand by. We just want, our viewers can see, that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, is now disembarking Air Force One in Philadelphia, where he is headed to that meeting with the GOP leadership. This comes just moments after the Mexican president tweeted that he is canceling his meeting with the president because of Donald Trump's insistence that Mexico will pay for the wall, and that if they don't agree to pay for it, that the meeting should not happen. Well, the Mexican president saying the meeting is not happening. And I guess, Mark, in this age that we're living in right now, where the President of the United States is tweeting, and that, to me, I mean, that tweet, you'll tell me if I'm wrong, Mark, is a diplomatic tweet. You're essentially laying out diplomacy on Twitter. I thought it was really interesting. Your colleague at the New York Times, Maggie Haberman, had a really interesting article last night about what Donald Trump is doing at the White House in the moments when he is not working, where he is monitoring social media. He's watching a lot of cable news and cable television. And we started to see, and I don't know if this is scientific yet, but that we've started to see the president reacting to things that he actually sees on television in real time almost. And some people have posited that his tweets about sending the federal government into Chicago is based off of some of his viewing habits. What do you make of that paradigm, this new world that we're living in?
Well, I mean, it is certainly a different paradigm. I mean, you're coming off basically 16 years of two presidents, President Bush and President Obama, who fairly unapologetically talked about their disdain for television news, for cable news, and not being caught up in that kind of minute-to-minute narrative. Now, Donald Trump is obviously a very, very different animal from anyone who came before him, but this is also, the times are different. I mean, he would probably say that he won a campaign this way. I mean, I think there was an interesting piece in, I guess, the Hollywood Reporter today by Michael Wolff about Kellyanne Conway, where Wolff said that Donald Trump ran essentially an entirely communications-based campaign. Didn't really bother with polling, didn't really bother with field organization. And, I think today to be communications-based is basically to just sort of monitor all this electronic noise and this barrage. And what's unique about this is you typically have had staff people to do this, but now you have the principal himself doing it and seemingly reacting, pretty impulsively. So, yeah, I mean, it makes things unpredictable, that's for sure.
We just got a sort of interesting bit of information from one of our producers. They were able to grab Sean Spicer on the tarmac and ask him about the news that the Mexican president has canceled the meeting. And what they were told from Spicer was, quote, "We will look for a date to schedule something in the future. We will keep the lines of communication open." And I think we've sort of seen this before, sort of tough talk and then a little softer sort of on the back end. I mean, it sounds like this idea, well, if you're not going to pay for the wall, then, the conversation is over, isn't really what it is.
Well, the question, of course, Mark, is the things that the people who support Donald Trump and are enthusiastic about the groundswell of support that he engendered during his very historic, and let's not forget, this was a historic election. You were just pointing out in the way that he communicated with his supporters. He defeated the Clinton machine. He defeated all of those other Republican, what he called combatants yesterday in that interview with David Muir. But still, I wonder, knowing what we now know about Donald Trump, that he himself is combative, that he doesn't like to back down, what that really means. Well, schedule something for the future would mean that you're going back to Mexico and saying, all right, maybe we were a little tough about the way we were talking, and let's figure out a way to get something done. How do you read it?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that. I mean, I guess, you could read Sean Spicer's remark just now as certainly more diplomatic, less impulsive. But I also think, you could see this as potentially a negotiating, posture in which Trump might be, you can almost sort of think about this a couple of moves out, whether he has or not. I mean, you sort of see him, say they reschedule a meeting in 6 weeks or so, and Trump could say that I got them to concede A, B, or C, when in fact they didn't do any such thing. I mean, I think maybe he sees this in the guise of like starting with a firm position and then going forward. But again, the world doesn't work like the world of politics, and the world of geopolitics certainly doesn't work like the world of business that Donald Trump is used to owning works.
Yeah,
Well, he
so
says
that's exactly what it seems like. The hard sell and then pull back.
He would say that he's negotiating. He says he's one of the world's great negotiators. The Art of the Deal, the book that he wrote, the New York Times bestseller. He would say that this is negotiation. But I guess, Mark, you made a good point here. You can perhaps elaborate for our viewers. In the president's mind, he believes that he can negotiate, and perhaps starting from a position of strength and then coming around to getting something done is what he would consider a strength. But what is the differentiation between how you negotiate in politics and how you negotiate in the world of business?
Well, I guess we're about to find out. I guess he's about to find out, because it obviously is very different. And again, he would say, he would say that, look, there's not a better negotiator in the world than Donald Trump. The Art of the Deal sold however million copies. And by the way, I also just won the election. I mean, in some ways, his answer for everything is the I won answer. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in a way, despite what might look kind of erratic from the outside, his message in a weird way is, trust me, I've done this before. Again, though, like we said before, it's a completely different animal. I think what you can't ignore here, though, is how Donald Trump thinks he might be able to sell whatever the eventual result of this is. I mean, even if nothing changes and the Mexicans are still absolutely maintaining that they will never pay for this wall, and somehow the meeting gets rescheduled in 6 weeks, again, you can see Trump selling this as after negotiating a number of small details, we decided that we would hold the meeting. I mean, he would probably see that as a victory. But
sort of an alternative fact, Mark? Would that be an alternative?
Well, I don't know if it's an alternative fact, but it's salesmanship. I mean, it sort of depends what the details are here, but it's salesmanship. I mean, he thinks that, the other big part of this is how you communicate what actually happened. I mean, he actually is, now seemingly in an ongoing effort to communicate that he actually won the popular vote in the 2016 election. Now, is that an alternative fact? Yeah, it is, because he didn't win the popular vote, but a lot of his supporters think so, and I think largely it's because he's been kind of driving a narrative saying that he in fact did, if not for these, supposedly illegal voters. So, I don't know. I mean, this is always a big part of the equation with him.
It is fascinating to watch. For those of us who are fascinated by world diplomacy, this is a very fascinating development. We'll have to see how it all plays out, as Mark points out. Mark Leibovich of the New York Times Magazine, we always appreciate your insight, your analysis, and your reporting. Thank you.
My pleasure, guys. Thanks.